Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to this episode of Jim's 5am Club. It's Monday morning, the first day of May, so happy May Day to all. Kali Proto Maya to all my Greek friends. And it's a beautiful morning, very, very still, as you can see. The reflections of these wonderful sparkling buildings are reflecting off Darling Harbour, and I'm heading to work, and I've got yet another book summary to get through today, adding to the 1533 that I've already completed. I'm on a path of growth and development for as long as I can, I guess. Not sure how many I'll ever get to do, but as long as there are book summaries available for me to get through, I will continue to pump through these on a daily basis wherever I can. The book summary that I've chosen to deliver today is an interesting one, and one that not all will be able to relate to and resonate with, but I'm sure it'll give us all some food for thought to consider some of the things that are going on around us, and how there are people that fall into these categories and hence influence the way they think, the way they behave, and the way they interact with the world around them. The book is entitled Highly Sensitive People by an author named Dr. Elaine Aron. And this book is all about understanding how these highly sensitive people, these HSPs, how they work, how they function, and to identify strategies for us to deal with them, and if you're an HSP, to help you identify and to connect with the strengths that you have available to you, as well as some of the weaknesses that you can learn to offset and manage. So the author kicks off with an interesting quote where she says that whatever the times, suffering eventually touches every life, and it's how we live with it and help others to live with it is one of the great creative and ethical opportunities that we will face in our lives. So a very productive thought from this author, and it reminds me of an experience that I was availed to just this year. My late Auntie Angela Kalpaxis had been ill for a number of years with a very, very rare disease known as scleroderma, where the skin and organs start to dry up for an unknown reason, and it creates lesions, and with those lesions, wherever there are bones in the body, it becomes very, very infected and very, very painful. Extreme pain. I've seen my auntie in extreme pain, and for years she experienced discomfort. But to her credit, because of her Christian beliefs, because of her passion and her drive that she gained from her church life and from her faith in God, she never complained, or she hardly ever complained, and basically got on with life and did whatever she could to manage the circumstances through her doctors and medications, and to continue to be a faithful person, one who believed in God and served God with all her heart, mind and soul. But what I learnt with Auntie Angela is that by all means people go through life with discomfort. You know, the hospitals around Australia and around the world are full of people who are going through pain. They have tremendous discomfort and they would give anything to relieve themselves of those discomforts and to live a normal life, the life that most of us are gifted with. But there are two types of people who sit within this category. There are people who suffer and there are people who don't suffer. And what I learnt from my Auntie Angela is that suffering is optional. We're all going to have, as the author says, a life full of discomfort and pain. But depending on how you think, depending on how you live, will determine how you view this pain and discomfort. And if you're able to put a meaning to it, if you're able to shape it in a way which is positive, then, as I mentioned before, suffering can be optional for those who find purpose and meaning in their discomfort and in their pain, as my Auntie Angela often did. She would go to church, she would be in the church choir, she'd be singing and chanting beautifully, angelically, and yet below the surface she had pains which most normal people wouldn't have and most people wouldn't understand or know about, and yet she masked it with her beautiful voice, with her smile and with her calmness under these circumstances. So the book kicks off with an example where the author says that they remember fondly the moment where Superman, and most of us, especially most baby boomers, grew up watching Superman on the black and white television. And the author says that for her, one of the most important moments in her life was the moment where she realized that Superman himself becomes aware of his heightened senses, where he could hear things miles away and he could hear things going on in people's bodies within proximity of him. So he was a different person in many ways, where his senses were heightened, and they were heightened for a reason, to enable him to be able to be called to action to help those in need. So he had an alarm system which had been set up with his heightened senses. But when he first becomes aware of his heightened senses, it just overwhelms him and he locks himself in a supply closet. And his mother comes to his rescue, so to speak, and gives him some advice, some empowering advice in terms of how to deal with his heightened senses. And she says to him, just try and make your world smaller. Learn how to focus on one thing at a time, which allowed him to calm down and to maintain control. So too, all of us have a thing in our brain called a reticular activating system, which is a filter which sits between our subconscious, our senses, and our consciousness. Because what happens is that everything that happens around us, every stimulation that that goes through our senses is recorded and captured by our subconscious system. But the reticular activating system is a filter which only allows certain elements of those senses and that sensory perception to bubble up to the surface. Else, if everything bubbled to the surface, we would be overwhelmed and would go absolutely crazy. Especially these days, where we live in a world where we are bombarded with lots and lots of marketing stimuli, lots of information from our phones, from our televisions, from the people around us. We live in a world which is probably more stimulated now than what it has ever been in the history of mankind. So we live in times where there is lots and lots of stimulation, and we all need to manage it in one shape or form. And taking Superman's mother's advice, we all need to shrink our world and focus on one or two things at a time, because at the end of the day, the human brain can only do things, a minimal amount of things at the same time. So there's about 5 or 6 things, I guess, that the brain can do at the one time, but it's best to do one thing at a time. So the whole concept of multitasking is a bit of a sham and not really all that productive. So we need this reticular activating system in our lives in order to manage the things that we're able to focus on, think about, so that we can live a productive life and not go crazy, as we mentioned here before. So the author then goes on to mention that about 15 to 20% of people can be categorized and described as highly sensitive. So it's not something that affects everybody. It affects maybe 1 in 5 people. Could affect you, could affect me. Doesn't affect everybody, but there are times where we are more subjected to hypersensitivity, and I guess in times of stress, in times of pressure, given that most people now live in highly stressful family environments and work environments, the percentage may continue to grow over time. So it's not what happens to you, it's how you manage it and how you deal with it, which is critical. So this book talks about how we first of all diagnose hypersensitivity and heightened sensitivity in us and people around us, and then how to deal with it. So the first key point to come from this author is where they say that there are 4 main traits associated with hypersensitivity to be able to identify people who are HSP, hypersensitive people. The first key trait is that these people are deep and thorough information processors. They overthink things. They think about things in a deep way. So that's one trait that can help us identify hypersensitivity. The second of the 4 traits, according to this author, is where the people have a above average attention to detail. So they are above average when it comes to having an eye for detail, an eye for looking at the small things, an eye for, OCD, where they are able to look at things and focus on things and have recurring sort of ruminating thoughts about things. The third aspect of HSP is that they are above average when it comes to being empathetic and emotional. And the fourth one, which is the interesting one, is that they have a tendency to be overstimulated and to react to all of this stimulation in a hypersensitive way. So as I said before, it's not what happens to you, it's what you do about it. So the hypersensitive people have a lot of traits, a lot of positive traits, strong traits, great traits, but sometimes they can be overstimulated. And these four things are basically tied to some genetic influences, and it goes hand in hand with other things such as ADHD and introversion. So to be an introverted person may have some of these traits and may be subjected to this overstimulation. On the other hand as well, it helps people make decisions, and you can shape these traits and these characteristics, as we discussed, to make better decisions and live a better life. The author also says that some other things that help identify hypersensitive people is that they are early risers, they are highly dexterous, and very creative, and they have certain addictions. They are more addicted or more inclined to enjoy caffeine, alcohol, and medications. So I've spent a little bit of time here just trying to identify who is an HSP, a highly sensitive person, or a hypersensitive person, and what helps shape them and get them to what they are. The next point that the author talks about here is the price that HSPs pay is overstimulation. So the negative aspect to hyperstimulation is being overstimulated, which can torpedo one's inner calm and may torpedo and interrupt the other positive traits that we discussed. Once again, overstimulation can be the enemy, where you can't deal or you can't process all of the wonderful things that you have available to you, and it forces you to shut down and to melt down and to overreact, which is the negative aspect to being hypersensitive. If you can control the overstimulation, then it is a significant advantage to be hypersensitive. But it's this last bit that is the key to what this book's on about. Because as we mentioned before, we have millions and millions of impressions foisted upon us every day, and we are the most stimulated generation that has ever existed. And what happens with HSPs, with hypersensitive people, is this extreme stimulation, this overstimulation, can bring people to exhaustion because of this over-arousal that they tend to feel. And in order to deal with it, sometimes there is a requirement to shut down and to zone out, which is, I guess, good for everybody, hence why we are encouraged to take holidays, RDOs, weekends off, and not to be always available to our friends and family, but to be strategic in how we use our time so that we don't destroy ourselves, especially in a world that is becoming more and more chaotic from a information and a stimulation perspective. So the last point that the author talks about here is a call to action to try and craft yourself a persona where you can set certain boundaries and limits to control the things that you can, even though we live in a world where we have lots of things that we can't control. And one of the key messages that the author talks about here is to deal the cards to the other people to enable them to play with. So be in control of the cards that you deal so that you're not swept up and caught up with the games that other people play, and at least you can manage your future wherever you can. So thank you very much for joining me on this episode of Jim's 5am Club on Monday morning, the 1st of May. Proto Maya. It looks like it's going to be a spectacular day. I would have loved to be able to capture the sunrise. There's not a cloud in the sky. It looks like it's going to be a magical Sydney autumn morning. Wishing you all the best. And as I said before, Kali Proto Maya and Christos Anesti, Christ is risen. The Greeks and all Christians are still celebrating the magic of Easter, the magic of Pascha, because for 40 days Jesus stayed amongst us, preaching to us after his resurrection, where he resurrected on the Ascension Thursday, which is 40 days after the Resurrection Sunday. Anyway, take care, all the very best, and wishing you a happy week and a great month. Yassas, bye for now.